Hello, everyone. Welcome to Proc-N-Roll, your guide to practical procurement, where we make procurement rock and roll. We've got Natasha, the pro CPO, Conrad, the innovator, and Zach, your expert on all things procurement. That's myself. We join you with almost 70 years of practical procurement experience. And here at Proc-N-Roll, we discuss the latest and greatest trends and topics in procurement. And so let's jump right into our episode for today, from savings to value. A few weeks ago, we released our Proc-N-Roll 2025 predictions, and Natasha and I both predicted that during the year ahead, the high maturity procurement teams will continue to shift from a focus on savings to a focus on value. So this is a long-term critical trend that continues to show up in procurement functions. And I really want to dive into this. Let's talk a bit about savings and historically how procurement has been tasked with delivering those savings, and then what that transition looks like in terms of moving to delivering value. Maybe Conrad, you can get us started off.
When I started in procurement, this is mid-90s, I went to Intel, and Intel is very savings focused, right? I was in a buyer role. We were responsible for a certain stewardship of savings. And we basically were responsible to get a certain percentage of cost savings. I was lucky enough to be on the technology side. So, I was delivering 15 to 20% savings all the time. But what I saw was some really weird behaviors from call it a reporting perspective. Some people were getting very creative on how they would count the savings, and because it was the motivation, right? It was the core metric. They were counting first 12 months savings. We could we could forecast what the savings would be if we got supplier consolidation, which almost never happened. People were starting to take numbers out of the denominator because, hey, this isn't mine, this is Natasha's. Like, this shouldn't be counting against my percentage. And then there was like 45 versions of the truth of what the spend was and where. I mean, it was just a big mess. We could talk for a lot of hours about direct savings, indirect savings, avoidance. I know we've all lived in that space for a long time, and I think some of those things are still sort of relevant-ish. Savings doesn't go away, I don't think, as we shift to value, but it definitely means we have to be more mature about how we're thinking about this stuff.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's such a big focus on savings sometimes, and it takes up so much time just trying to define what a saving is and how you're going to report on your savings that you completely miss the mark on thinking about other value levers that you could be pulling, which might not be as easily quantifiable. Natasha, what's your experience?
More often than not, in the companies I've been with, the savings was the S word. It was a bad word. Had a terrible reputation. So I cannot believe that we are contributing the whole podcast to the S word. But let's think about it practically, right? If someone can tell you that, hey, I can free up some money, you're going to keep more in your pocket, would you ever say no? No, you wouldn't, right? Whether you are an individual or a firm, would you ever say no for paying less for buying something that you absolutely need for business to function? It's hard to imagine any organization that would say, nah, we're totally fine throwing money on out of the window. I think the reason that savings is considered to be an S word and drives often suspicions or uncertainty is because it's hard to prove it real. And I think it's one of the major challenge that a lot of procurement professionals struggle with is how do you create credibility that savings is real, that it's not funny money, that's not monopoly, that it's not like definition, if we have a 10-year contract, we can count savings for all 10 years. Oh my God, on year 3, you no longer have people who signed this agreement, who counted the savings. The baseline has changed already after 12 months because P&L gets reset, right? So I think there are a lot to be done in every organization on how to make savings real and how to make it credible.
Hey, Natasha, let me just make a comment here. When I was at Adobe, we had finance come in and sort of validate our calculation. So that was part of the process. Like finance was going to come in and say, okay, this is the formula. This is what you did. Okay, that looks good. And interestingly enough, as those were reported up to the CFO, the CFO still questioned the credibility of the savings, right? Because the CFO wanted me to show up in his office with a wheelbarrow full of money. That's what they really, or where is this money? Where is this money that you saved, right?
So Conrad, those are two different questions.
No, but all I'm saying is that's in his mind. He's like, if you can't show me the money, you didn't really save the money. And I totally get that it's a wrong mindset, but it's so complicated to achieve what you said before, which is credibility in the savings.
But that's my point. I want to separate two separate things, right? Maybe, and I wasn't part of the conversation, so correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe CFO did not question credibility because if his FP&A or her FP&A team validated savings, they believed that savings was achieved. But very few companies know how to track savings to the bottom line. And that's a different thing. So they believe that the contract indeed was signed for the price less than was historically paid. There was indeed P&L reduction achieved. They just don't see it on a P&L or they don't see it on the budget. And those are validation and tracking are two separate problems.
Yeah, but Natasha, that shows that savings is still on the agenda, right? And CFOs obviously want to see what the savings are. But in all this talk of driving savings, you lose the bigger picture. And I want to talk a little bit about total cost of ownership, or TCO as we're going to call it, right? If you take a TCO style approach, you might be driving savings from so many different parts of that operating model or that purchasing model that you've got, and it just becomes, is it even worth trying to validate every penny saved and really trying to point to how this is turned into real cash? Should finance be, joining procurement and empowering procurement and saying, you know what, we're not going to nickel and dime you on every little saving, but we'll agree some methodologies, we'll trust your process, and we trust that you are actually delivering value to the bottom line ultimately.
Well, I think total cost of ownership is, as I've thought about this, you kind of have this continuum from price, like a price focus, to a value focus. And TCO is kind of like a step on the journey there. And if you're really looking at TCO in a mature way, maybe it's almost to the value journey by itself. But it's the idea of focusing beyond price when you go into a negotiation, understanding a deal and working with a stakeholder, to me, that starts to give you the magic about what matters, what's valuable to the organization that I need to deal with, whether it's, less of a maintenance cost, less of a server footprint, more, free warehouse space from the supply. I mean, there's just so many things that can be in the TCO that, to me, if it's done right versus formulaic, it begins, like I said, to move your thinking towards the value.
But it becomes very hard to explain that to like a finance person, because then they need to learn all about that category or product or service that you're buying and how you've broken it down into different cost elements and then managed to save money. Natasha, have you had experience with TCO before?
Can I just for a second go back to where we started about value, right? Because we kind of like got started drilling on the savings and credibility and validation of savings. But I want to go to the value. And value is perceived differently, not just by different companies, but even within the same company, value is perceived differently. You speak with legal, their value is risk management. You speak with marketing, their value is speed to market. You speak with supply chain, their value is available capacity, right? So how does procurement structure its approach to driving value, whether it's TCO or not TCO? But I think it's a very important aspect for procurement professionals to not diversify, but kind of like to maybe tailor or customize their value proposition to different groups depending on what's important to them versus what's important to procurement. And that goes back to one of our previous podcasts when we were talking about like If we want to build strong relationships with the stakeholders and help them to impact their spend under management, then let's find a way to stop speaking procurement lingo and switch to what's important to them.
So, Natasha, I agree with you. I think we kind of need to move into the value conversation, but I think what you're highlighting is that the whole point of what we do is to enable business success. What success means to that function or that company, or even the same company, the same function 10 years later, based on their maturity and their changes, it's different. So when you stop and say, what are your metrics for success? It's very easy to say, well, price or cost, specific cost saving and pricing is very tangible. You can put a formula and a number, and you say enable business success. Like, what does that really mean? Because it means 1,000 different things, and it's really hard to put a number. But I think what's really important is we all remain very focused. Goal here is business success. And then there's a number of things we need to do in this journey to value, which is understanding what business success looks like and how to achieve that over time. I think that's, if you said what is really value, it's success to the business, which could be sustainability. It could be, vocal spending, and there's so many things that it could be in any given situation. But yeah, we're here to enable business success. Different in every function, different in every company.
Okay. Well, let's talk about how we make that real then, Conrad, right? So what are the pillars required to make the shift from savings to value, or from transactional to something more strategic? And I've got here 3 things that I think are really key, right? So the first one is the talent. You got to make sure you have the right people and they're focused on the right objectives, and they're not really in that transactional mindset. They have the talent to form stakeholder relationships, and that'll be the second thing, stakeholder relationship management, knowing who your stakeholders are, having relationships with them, understanding what they're trying to achieve, and then going out and proactively finding ways to add value for those stakeholders. And then the third pillar would be supplier relationship management. So you're managing the stakeholder, but you also need to manage the supplier to make sure that you're really driving that end-to-end value. And I've got some examples here of companies that do procurement a little bit differently. So Conrad, you mentioned Intel at the beginning, your alma mater, and Intel emphasizes innovation and sustainability, right? So they focus on having a superior quality of technology, more collaborative supplier partnerships, to be able to source kind of the newest and greatest materials, etc., for manufacturing, and also they've got a commitment to like environmental change and ESG, etc. Tesla, on the other hand, is really focused less on the innovation sustainability side, but more on integration of advanced technology. So they emphasize sustainable energy, they emphasize innovation through competitive dialogue. Coca-Cola is responsible for sourcing and sustainability. So again, big focus on supplier relationships, on supply chains, on transparency over how everything is moving through the supply chain. At Transport for London, which is TfL, for those who live in
right
London.
In your neighborhood.
Right in my neighborhood, exactly. So they have a big focus on addressing their talent shortages and making sure that they have a diverse workforce. And so my point is, it's not to the examples. My point is, all these procurement organizations orient themselves to driving value in different ways. And I think those are the 3 pillars: talent, stakeholder relationship management, and then your supplier relationship management. Would you agree with those 3 principles?
No, it's interesting. I think you have the stakeholders that help us understand what value matters. You have the talent that allows us to kind of go get that and figure it out. And then you have our suppliers who help us execute and deliver that, right? So yeah,
Right.
and I think that's a really good set of 3 things as the pillars to make this work.
Okay, well, why don't we go into them then? So let's start with talent. Okay, so what are some of the skills, behaviors that are required for you to move from a savings-driven procurement function to a value-driven procurement function? Natasha, any views?
Going back to, again, one of our previous episodes when we were discussing the importance of intellectual curiosity and problem solving for procurement professionals, right? So procurement professional is always a matchmaker between the stakeholders and suppliers, right? Or at least that's the role that we are designed to play. And if you clearly understanding what the business objectives are, and where your stakeholders trying to take the business to the next level, and what's they're offering to companies' customers. And when you understand from supplier perspective what kind of solutions they have in place to enable stakeholders and the business side to move forward, then you can always find a way to help creating a powerful solution, right? And cost component, and this is where we're talking about total cost of ownership. Sometimes you pay more to get to market faster and generate more revenue and secure a greatest market niche. And that's a perfectly well calculated decision. Yes, we'll pay more, right?
So yeah, that was my question, Natasha, was do you need the right talent and has the enterprise mindset that can connect the dots, right, to drive real enterprise value? And so it's a different caliber of a procurement professional that we're looking for today. So if you're interviewing somebody from procurement, you're not asking them about the savings they've delivered. And you get the CV which says, my key achievements, I've saved 100 million, I've saved 50 million. And people just chuck at these big, huge numbers, which, as we've talked about, nobody's validated half the time because they struggle and it takes a whole long time. So you're looking for a different CV altogether, right? You're looking for maybe more of a sales type of skill set, or problem solving. So maybe more of a consulting skill set in some cases as well.
I wouldn't differentiate that that's consulting or traditional procurement, or I wouldn't question the numbers people put on their CV. It's all coming up, having like problem solving or critical thinking. It's a skill. You can train yourself, right? It just all depends also in which procurement environment you grew up. If you grew up in low maturity, kind of like more purchasing environment, if you grew up in manufacturing where it's kind of like it's a volume buy, it's just a volume driven negotiation and you squeeze suppliers on the margins, then you have one way of thinking. But if you grow up especially in indirect space that is constantly changing, that is very diversified, then you build a skill of shift, like you're changing your hats very often because you're switching from buying a water to buying a jet to buying vending machines to buying plastic to move hangers in the stores from metal to putting the sizes on the neck of the hanger. So you're constantly improvising and learning new stuff. So that's why we triple emphasizing on creative thinking, problem solving, like critical reasoning.
Well, I'm trying to think, how do you make that shift culturally? If you have a low maturity procurement organization that was established 5 years ago and all of your team are focused on driving savings and getting the lowest price possible and really, beating up suppliers, as some people might put it, how do you induce that change in mindset, amongst your team? I have two thoughts on this. One is, first of all, there's nothing wrong with always trying to get the most efficient pricing, right? There might be some situations where that is the best thing that you could be doing. But I think the counterpoint to that is there's always a bit of value that you can go after that's beyond savings. So if you're not thinking of that, and it might come at the cost of savings, like you said, Natasha, faster speed to market relative to cost. How do you induce that in your team, from a talent point of view? You mentioned training.
When I started in procurement, we worked in a cubicle, and I think I rarely came out of my cubicle. It was a very transactional administrative role that I started in the 90s. And then we got to a point where we actually came out of there and started talking to our stakeholders, talking to our suppliers in a different way. That's why I think that most organizations are somewhere along the line of this journey from super transactional and administrative in procurement. In a lot of ways, they've taken those teams, right? They created buy desks and they've pushed the transactions sort of off the plate of the sourcing or the category manager so they can be more strategic. But ultimately, it comes down to a recognition that your team has what it takes, or maybe they're missing what it takes. Zach, your question is, how do you get there? I love the stakeholder map that Natasha shared with us a couple of weeks ago. As you're talking to the leadership level and you're getting insight into what next level are thinking and expecting about procurement, a lot can happen in terms of understanding where those gaps are. Are my team really connecting? Are they coming back with no understanding of what matters to the business? Or are they coming back with a clear understanding that really resonates with that top level leader? I mean, that's really important. And that will begin to tell us whether our people have the skills, maybe even the motivation, the incentive, the rewards, whatever it is to drive them down the path that we need to be at. I think people can learn this. I'm a closet introvert. I think I've come out of the closet a little bit, and I've started talking to people over 30 years, and I found I actually like it. But you've got to move people along that journey. But, hiring different people, looking at skills, a lot of different things.
Get out of the cubicle, you said.
Yes.
I would also say that, and that can be very controversial statement. So I'm happy to debate anyone who would want me, who would want to debate me on that.
Which one?
I think
what's the controversy? What's the controversy, Natasha? What do you mean?
Let me get to it, Conrad. Hold on. So, procurement effectiveness is often measured by how much savings procurement delivered. It's one of the key numerical metrics that procurement has. I think that the bravery of the leader of CPO or head of procurement is to free the team from the pressure of the number. And in the beginning of the year to say, do you see that this is our goal? 100 million, 100 billion, whatever the number is. Do you see the number? Okay, now forget about the number for the next 12 months.
That's brave for a CPO to do that, isn't it?
And say, just do the right thing for the company. Like you, category owner, look at the category of spend and own the hell out of it and figure out what is the right thing to do for the company. I can assure you that in 100% cases, the number will show up on its own. Because if you're doing the right thing for the company, if you're making the right steps to propel the business toward where the business is growing to, the savings will come.
I love that. I really love that, Natasha. I was telling you about finance questioning our results. In my Adobe role, the CFO was questioning it. When I moved into that leadership role, we had a metric from the previous leader that was, I don't remember, like $100 million over 3 years, which for some organizations that would be huge. Others, it would be trivial, right? But $100 million over 3 years, the metric was achieved. He sort of was telling me that these questions about its credibility, and because of my feelings and Natasha's, same as you just described, I just deliberately decided I'm not going to report savings until he asks for it. Like, this is something I did with the CFO. Previous leader was reporting savings every month. I just stopped reporting savings. It took almost 2 years before the CFO asked me if I was ever going to report savings. And that prompted a conversation where I said, well, I wasn't going to, but if you think it's important, then let's talk about what you want to see and how you want to define that, which led to about a 6-month conversation and back and forth with me and him, which uncovered a whole bunch of nuance about what was really happening in the mechanics of the budget and the savings and, where that wheelbarrow of money really was at the end of the day. But almost 2 years before it even came up. So, I agree, Natasha, a lot of times the idea of setting that to the side is really scary. But there is a path, and I think the CFOs want to understand this and they want to support us as well. But they're operating from where they've been in the past, which has been probably very formulaic.
I'd say that if the head of procurement set the clear strategy and clear vision and is very connected to the key functions of the company, then walking that path will bring to the savings. But it's not something like hitting the number should not be a driving factor should not be driving motivation for our teams, because then it incentivizes the wrong behavior. And when people are chasing the numbers, they are forfeiting doing the right things for the business. So that's my philosophy, and I stick by it. I also spoke with a couple of colleagues, and they actually said that it's CFOs who freed them up from any savings targets, and said the most important thing is spend under management, because if procurement touched the spend, and even if it didn't generate the savings, it means that someone took a very close look at the payment terms in an educated manner, that someone took a look at the risk profile of the supplier, someone took a look at how many suppliers are there, someone took a close look at I don't know, at the duplication of services or delivery schedule or whatever that is. And the measuring criteria of the main criterion of procurement efficiency and effectiveness was actually if the spend under management grew regardless of the savings. They didn't even report the savings. They that's not the most critical part, right? So that's also a very clever way for the CFO to enable and empower procurement organization by shifting priorities from drive to the number toward doing the right thing.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the CFOs will support this this transition to value 100%. It strikes me as we're talking about talent here that, and I mentioned it before, like what is the metric or what is the goal of success for the team member is probably, it's really easy to see when it's like this pure cost savings, direct, indirect avoidance. But once you get to the ambiguity around do the right thing for the business, it does take a special kind of person to understand and implement what that means, right? I think it's a mature business strategic mindset, problem solving, you're adapting, you're learning, right? There's a lot of things you're doing at that level that if they're very transactional and follow the instructions minded, they're probably going to struggle in that space. But yeah, I think this talent thing we're talking about makes perfect sense. And I think we're probably, as we're talking about the CFO, like the CFO is one of these internal stakeholders, like the second pillar that as a leader, we've got to go manage that piece and across the rest of the stakeholder map as well.
Yeah, so we talked about talent. We've talked about, getting out of the cubicle, about the enterprise mindset, about stakeholder mapping, lots of great stuff there. And then we also talked about, like you said, Conrad, stakeholder management. Seems like finance and the CFO are really one of the top people on that list to get on side quickly. I think the way Natasha put it, do the right things for the business, savings will come, right? So move that direction. I want to shift gears a little bit to now focusing a little bit on the supplier side, right? So we've got our act together internally as procurement. How do we engage our suppliers in this transformation from savings to value?
I don't think you have to do much to engage suppliers. They're always willing to engage, right? The trick is into finding and identifying who are the right partners. And this is where responsibility of procurement professionals is in very mindful and thorough assessment of the market, right? And understanding who are the right players, right? And segmentation, it's again, it all goes back to education, like know your business, know who are the key players. Don't always automatically switch to a large proven solution, because like the philosophy of nobody gets fired for hiring IBM, it's may no longer be helpful to the business, right? Because very often we need to solve business problems, more niche solution and more specific knowledge and more practical approach to make business objectives real than theoretical strategizing.
I love the segmentation comment because it's really important to understand who the suppliers are and how those suppliers fit into the business objectives we were talking about before, right? Because we've talked to the stakeholders, we understand what matters most to the business. If the business has a real big goal around environmental sustainability and a carbon footprint, then somebody's got to go in and say which of our suppliers have the biggest positive or negative impact on our carbon footprint. So now we're segmenting across some of these big value drivers for the organization. And then as we're managing them, we're now bringing a metric to the table that matters to our business, right? And we're building a KPI around that. We're having quarterly business reviews, and we're trying to drive or change, influence their behavior in support of what matters most to the business. Which, as you segment one group of suppliers around one of these, there's probably another group of suppliers that touches one of the other ones. In marketing, it's usually around creativity and innovation and growing the business. And so the KPIs as you're managing that supplier are going to look quite a bit different than the KPI that you have at your cloud provider, right? But knowing that means you have an understanding of the business well enough that when you're sitting down with them, you're driving them in the direction of those values that matter. Just like the Intel and the Tesla and the London transportation, whoever that was, right? Their business priorities were driving how they were engaging with their suppliers.
Right. I think it's valuable to think about the levers you've got available to you when you go and talk to a supplier, because very often the suppliers that you deal with, especially if you've been transactional in the past, will just assume you're out to get the best cost. And so they disengage, or they'll come in with a really high quote and then they'll expect to haggle you when they get into the room with you. I think it really catches some suppliers off guard when you bring them into the room and you say, you know what? I don't want to talk about pricing. I want to talk about these other objectives that I'm trying to achieve and how you're going to help me achieve them. And we can talk about price afterwards.
Yeah. I'd add to that what's the key secret for successful relationships? Communication, right? Procurement professionals historically keep all the information they have very close to the vest, and they don't share anything with suppliers, and really hoping that suppliers are mind readers and will figure out on their own what's expected of them. What if procurement professionals will clearly state their intentions and their objectives and the challenges they're facing? I'm not suggesting that let's share the budget, right? So some information has to remain closely watched and shared only on a needed basis. But very often we kind of like creating artificial barriers, thank you, and that suppliers have to jump through instead of just openly sharing that this is the environment, this is the problem statement, this is what we're trying to figure out, these are our limitations, how can you help us to overcome it? And then just sit and listen, and you will see that if a company that the supplier represents, if they are capable to deliver you what your business needs or not.
I agree. I've seen that as well, Natasha. Very often procurement teams are very bad at communicating what it is that they're after, right? In fact, the supplier, when they meet the counterpart from the business, will suddenly understand the big picture, but procurement had missed that big picture, and procurement have just gone off, spoken to the stakeholder, put a little bit of a brief together. They don't really understand deeply, what the objectives are of that function of the business, and you're absolutely right that gets lost, and it's such a waste of value in my view, because very often when I'm dealing with suppliers, and this is something that's served me really well, I always assume that they want to work with me and that they're coming to the table willing to help. And I think that's a really good presumption to have, as opposed to you thinking, oh, a supplier is an adverse party. No, they're not. Supplier is a party that wants to engage with you, wants to get more out of the relationship as well. And they would love for procurement to come to the table and just be more open and share more insights and share more data. So I really think that's a mindset that drives real transformation.
I think this comes back to the talent piece a little bit, because you get a person who is able to recognize that and manage that relationship, see the nuances, communicate clearly. That is again, that's a different skill than a transactional administrative mindset and approach. You're a relationship builder, you're a communicator, you're a collaborator, and you're essentially this channel that is enabling and bringing value from the supplier to the business, to the stakeholder, and you got to always ask yourself, if you took this person out of the middle of this relationship and it was just the supplier directly to the business, is the relationship better than it would be if you're not there? If the answer is no, like, you really got to question your delivery of value to the relationship. It better be better because you're there, or just get out of the way.
I think that's a great litmus test. Yeah, sure. Okay, that's great. I mean, we've covered the 3 pillars. So we got talent, stakeholder relationship management, and supplier relationship management. I think procurement function needs to be thinking about their next steps. So maybe it's reevaluating a supplier relationship, or maybe it's going out and connecting with others in your category or in that field, attending industry events, etc., or engaging more with the stakeholders in the business. But I think what we're saying is there's this fundamental shift that's occurring where procurement teams are moving from this focus on costs and savings to value. I think we agree that savings will always be a key thing that procurement teams will have to do, but that actually they should be segmenting more proactively. They should be trying to cover more of the spend, as we talked about, so touch more of the spend under management, and really segment suppliers based on the different types of value that they can drive from those particular suppliers. And here's a final thought. Could focusing on value actually lead to greater savings in the long run? And that's something, Natasha, I think you were saying, and I think that's a really great point.
100%.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, thank you to our listeners. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm sure we're going to talk about savings and value a lot more in the coming episodes. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Conrad, and see you in the next episode.